Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Have a good day.
Before I tell you what my hands did at my son's birthday party, I need you to understand something about those hands. They had held a beating human heart. More than 600 times. They had worked inside chest cavities no larger than a salad bowl, repairing valves the size of a thumbnail, redirecting vessels thinner than a drinking straw. For 30 years, those hands had never once betrayed me. Not under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning. Not after 18 hours without sleep. Not even the night Sarah died. When I drove straight from the hospital to the OR because a 43-year-old father of 3 needed a bypass, and I was the only one available. They were steady hands. They were, for most of my adult life, the most reliable thing about me. Which is why, when they trembled over my son's birthday cake on a Friday night in November, I told myself it was nothing. The party was everything Michael liked. Loud, expensive, crowded with people whose names I only half remembered. His Chicago apartment had been rearranged to fit 70 guests. The furniture pushed back, a catering team moving through the rooms with practiced efficiency. Someone had strung warm lights across the ceiling. The cake was 3 tiers, chocolate, with 30 candles already lit when they carried it out. I was standing near the kitchen doorway, a glass of sparkling water in one hand, watching my son laugh at something a colleague had said. Michael at 30 looked the way I imagined I had looked at 30. Tall, easy in a room. The kind of man who makes conversation appear effortless. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well. Diane appeared at my elbow. My daughter, 27, her mother's cheekbones and her mother's way of arriving somewhere without you noticing the approach. "You look tired." "Father," she said. Not Dad. Father. She had been saying it that way for years, and I had long since stopped noticing. "I'm fine," I told her. "Long week." She studied me for a moment with those gray eyes, the ones that belonged to Sarah, then nodded once and moved away toward the drink table. I watched her go and felt, very briefly, the particular unease of a man who has said the right words in the wrong tone. Then they brought the cake out, and everyone gathered, and Michael caught my eye across the room and grinned, and I let the feeling go. They handed me the knife. It was a simple thing. A cake knife. Silver-handled. Light. I had held instruments 100 times more delicate with 100 times more at stake. I closed my fingers around the handle and positioned the blade above the first tier and pressed down. My hand trembled, not violently, not the kind of trembling that makes people step back, just a fine, barely visible vibration, the kind that would register only to someone who knew what steady looked like. Michael was laughing at something to my left. Diane was watching from near the window. Kara, my head surgical nurse, who had come as Michael's guest, was smiling at something on her phone. Nobody noticed. I made the cut. I handed slices to the people nearest me. I smiled when the room sang happy birthday. I stayed another 40 minutes, said my goodbyes, told Michael it was a wonderful party, and drove home through the November dark with both hands on the wheel, watching them. They were still now, perfectly still. So it was nothing. I told myself. A long week. Low blood sugar. 60 seconds of fatigue after 30 years of perfect function. I almost believed it. I have a small office on the 2nd floor of my house in Lincoln Park. One wall is bookshelves, floor to ceiling. Mostly medical texts mixed with the novels Sarah used to press on me and I never quite finished. There is a desk, a lamp, and a locked cabinet where I keep a set of basic neurological assessment tools. The kind of equipment a cardiac surgeon keeps at home the way a carpenter keeps a level in his truck. Just in case, I sat down at the desk at 11:43 that night and ran the assessment on myself, finger to nose. Alternating hand movements, fine motor precision test with a pen and a narrow line drawn on a legal pad. Grip dynamometry using a small handheld device I had owned for 15 years. I did each one twice. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the results for a long time. The gross motor functions were normal. The fine motor scores were within acceptable range. But the tremor index, measured by a small sensor on the dynamometer, showed an irregularity, slight, consistent, the kind of reading that, in a patient, I would not dismiss. In a patient, I would order further testing. I am not a man who panics. 30 years in cardiac surgery will either build that quality in you or destroy you, and I had survived long enough to know which direction I had gone. So I did not panic. I sat in my office at nearly midnight and I thought, with the same methodical calm I brought to a difficult diagnosis, about what this reading meant. Fatigue could produce it. So could stress. So could a dozen benign neurological variations that resolved on their own. So could something else entirely. I wrote 3 words on the legal pad beneath the test results, in the same handwriting I had used for 30 years of surgical notes. Clear, precise, unambiguous, not aging. Investigate. Then I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the house settle around me, and thought about the way Diane had looked at me when she said I seemed tired. Not with worry, with something that was measuring. There is a particular silence inside an operating room that exists nowhere else on earth. It is not the silence of an empty space. It is the silence of absolute focus, every person in that room reduced to their function. Every sound deliberate. Every movement purposeful. I had lived inside that silence for 30 years. It was the place I was most myself. The morning I hesitated in it for the first time. I knew something was genuinely wrong. The patient was a 61-year-old retired school teacher named Gerald Marsh. Atrial fibrillation with a structural valve defect that had gone unaddressed for 2 years longer than it should have. Straightforward by the standards of Cole Cardiac Center, which meant it was still a procedure that would have paralyzed most surgeons outside a specialized unit. I had reviewed his scans the night before. I had slept adequately. I had eaten breakfast. I scrubbed in at 7:15 and took my position at the table. Kara was across from me, as she had been for 8 years. Her movements were the mirror of mine, anticipating instrument changes before I asked, adjusting the field light with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned my rhythms the way musicians learn a score. We had performed somewhere north of 900 procedures together. We did not need to speak much inside the OR. We rarely did. I made the initial incision, and then I stopped. 1 second, maybe 2. Long enough for Kara to glance up from the field. Long enough for Ray Simmons, my anesthesiologist of 11 years, to shift his weight almost imperceptibly on the other side of the drape. I completed the procedure. Gerald Marsh's valve was repaired with the precision his case required. His heart resumed its corrected rhythm at the expected interval. By 10:40, he was being transferred to recovery with a prognosis his family would find deeply relieving. In the scrub room afterward, Ray Simmons pulled the door closed behind him. "You hesitated," he said. Not accusatory. Careful. The way a man speaks when he is saying something that needs to be said, and he would rather not be the one saying it. Momentary distraction, I told him. Ray looked at me for a moment. He was 58, with the permanently tired eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades monitoring the boundary between consciousness and its absence. He did not look convinced. Martin, that's not you. Everyone has an off morning. Not you, he said again. Not in there. I held his gaze steadily. I appreciate the concern. Ray, Gerald Marsh is in recovery with a functional valve. I'll see you Thursday. I left before he could respond. The administrative wing of Cole Cardiac Center occupied the east side of the 4th floor, a series of offices that smelled of recycled air and old coffee, and the particular staleness of rooms where important things happened without windows. My office was at the end of the corridor, corner unit, a concession to 30 years of building something from nothing. I sat at my desk at 2 in the afternoon and opened the filing system I had not accessed in 3 weeks. Cole Cardiac Center generated an enormous volume of documentation, research agreements, insurance authorizations, equipment contracts, patient data governance records. Most of it moved through the administrative team without requiring my direct signature. The things that did require it came to me through James Pryor, my attorney, or through our internal compliance officer, a meticulous woman named Sandra Reeves, who had worked with me for 14 years. I was not looking for anything specific. I was doing what I did when something felt wrong, and I could not yet name the source. I went back to the data. I found it in the 3rd folder, a data governance agreement between Cole Cardiac Center and an entity called Nexogen Pharmaceutical Partners, LLC, dated 8 weeks prior, covering the transfer of anonymized longitudinal cardiac data from our patient database, 641 patient records spanning 30 years for the purposes of pharmaceutical research and drug development. My signature was at the bottom of page 4. I stared at it for a long time. Then I pulled up my calendar for the date on the document and cross-referenced it against my surgical schedule, my meeting log, and the entry record for my office building. On the date that document had been signed, I had been in a conference in Boston. I had the hotel receipt on my phone. I had shaken hands with 3 department heads from Massachusetts General at a dinner that evening. I had not been in this building. I had not seen this document, but there was my signature, in my handwriting, precise and consistent with every other signature I had produced in 30 years. I set the document face down on my desk. My hands were completely still. I thought about the tremor index reading from 2 nights before. I thought about Ray Simmons in the scrub room saying, "That's not you," with the careful tone of a man delivering a warning he hoped would not be necessary. I thought about Diane at Michael's party, studying my face with those measuring eyes, and I thought about something Sarah had told me once. Early in our marriage, when I had missed a pattern in a difficult diagnosis and she, who was not a physician and had no medical training whatsoever, had spotted it immediately. "Martin," she had said, "you look so hard at the thing in front of you that you forget to look at everything around it." I picked up my phone and dialed James Pryor. He answered on the second ring. "James," I said, "I need you to find out everything you can about a company called Nexogen Pharmaceutical Partners. Registered entity, beneficial ownership, any connections to existing pharmaceutical firms." Quietly. A brief pause. "How quietly? As if it doesn't exist yet," I said. "Until I tell you otherwise." After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the afternoon quiet of my office and looked at the document still lying face down on my desk. Outside the window, Chicago moved at its indifferent November pace. Gray sky, gray lake. The city entirely unconcerned with what was happening on the fourth floor of a cardiac center on Michigan Avenue. I turned the document back over and looked at my signature one more time. Someone had been in this office, I thought. Someone who knew my handwriting well enough to reproduce it. Someone with access to this building, this filing system, and enough knowledge of my schedule to choose a day when I was 400 miles away. I thought about who had that kind of access. The list was not long. Sarah used to say that I saw everything inside a chest cavity and nothing inside my own home. She said it the way she said most true things, quietly, directly, with that expression she had when she wanted me to hear something and understood that saying it louder would only make me more deaf to it. She was right. I just never understood how completely right she was until she was no longer there to tell me. Her photograph sat on the bookshelf in my home office, the one Sarah had always called the real office, to distinguish it from the clinic where, she said, I kept the version of myself that belonged to other people. In the photograph, she was 51, standing in our Vermont garden, laughing at something outside the frame. Her eyes were gray and direct and carried that quality she had of seeing further into a situation than the people standing inside it. 4 years. It had been 4 years since the cancer took her. 4 years since I had come home to a house that was identical in every visible way and entirely different in every way that mattered. Promise me you'll see them. Martin. Near the end. When the medication made everything slower and she had stopped pretending the things she wanted to say could wait. Really see them. Not just when they need something. See them when they don't. I had promised, standing in front of her photograph that Sunday evening, 4 days after finding the Nexigen document. I thought about how comprehensively I had failed to keep that promise. I set down the glass of water I had forgotten to drink and went to find her journals. Sarah had kept journals for most of our marriage. Spiral-bound notebooks. Nothing precious. She had filled perhaps 40 of them over 30 years, and I had kept every one in a cedar box in the bedroom closet, because throwing them away had seemed impossible, and reading them had seemed, for a long time, equally so. I was not looking for anything specific. When something felt wrong and I could not name it, I went back to the source material. It was the only method I trusted. I found the journals from her last 2 years and carried them to the desk. Her handwriting in the early pages was the handwriting I knew precise, slightly slanted, quick on the page the way her mind had always been quick. By the later pages, it had slowed, the letters larger, the lines less straight. On a page dated 14 months before she passed. I stopped. I tried to talk to Diane again today. She was perfectly pleasant. She asked about my medication and whether I needed anything from the store. She did everything correctly. She has always done everything correctly since she was 16. That is what frightens me. The correctness. A child who has decided to be correct has decided something about the people they are being correct for. I read it 3 times. Then I turned the page. The next leaf had been removed. Cleanly. Carefully. Close to the spine. Not torn. Cut with the kind of patience that leaves no ragged edge. Someone had taken that page. I sat with that for a long moment, the journal open in my hands, looking at the thin strip of paper still attached to the spine. Sarah had written something after that paragraph about Diane, and someone had decided it should not exist anymore. I thought about who had access to this house. I thought about who had been here in the weeks after Sarah's funeral, helping to organize, helping to sort, being perfectly and correctly helpful. I closed the journal and held it in my lap and listened to the house settle around me. Kara had left her jacket on the hook by the back door. She had come by that afternoon to drop off a revised OR schedule. She had stayed 20 minutes, made tea she did not finish, asked twice whether I was eating properly, and left with the comfortable ease of someone who had stopped feeling like a guest here long ago. I had not thought anything of it. I noticed the jacket when I came downstairs at 11:15. I lifted it from the hook to set it on the counter, and the phone in its inside pocket slid free and landed face up on the floor. The screen was lit, a message preview, visible for 3 seconds before the display dimmed. 4 words, from a number listed only as M. Is it working yet? I stood in my kitchen in the dark and looked at the place on the floor where the phone had been. Then I picked it up and set it carefully on the counter without touching the screen again. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car moved through the wet November street. Is it working yet? No question mark. The kind of message sent between people who already understand the subject without naming it. Because naming it is the one thing they cannot afford. I left the jacket on the counter and went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. I thought about 30 years of steady hands, about a signature on a document I had never touched, about a page cut cleanly from a dead woman's journal. And I thought about the word yet. Yet meant it had started. Yet meant there was a timeline. Yet meant whatever was happening inside my body had been designed to progress on a schedule that someone else had set. I did not sleep that night. I had spent 30 years understanding how the human body betrays itself from the inside. A valve that looks intact, but leaks under pressure. A rhythm that appears normal until you measure it against what normal actually requires. The body is extraordinarily good at hiding what is wrong right up until the moment it cannot hide it anymore. I was very good at finding what bodies tried to conceal. It was time to apply that skill to something other than a chest cavity. The coffee arrived every morning at 7:15. Kara prepared it in the small kitchen adjacent to my clinic office, 2 scoops of the dark roast I had used for 20 years. Filtered water. Nothing added. She set it on my desk before I arrived, so that by the time I sat down it had cooled to exactly the temperature I preferred. I had never asked her to do this. It had simply begun, somewhere in the 2nd year of our working together, and continued so seamlessly that I had stopped registering it as a choice anyone made. I registered it now. On Monday morning, I arrived at the clinic 40 minutes before Kara was scheduled. I made the coffee myself, using the same beans, the same method. I filled my usual mug and set it on my desk. Then I took a second sample, 2 ounces, in a sealed specimen container I had brought from home, and labeled it with the date and time in handwriting small enough that it would not be visible at a casual distance. I locked the container in my briefcase. When Kara arrived at 7:10 and found the coffee already made, she paused in the kitchen doorway for just a fraction of a second. Her expression did not change. She said good morning and asked if I had slept better. I told her I had. She nodded and moved to her desk, and the morning proceeded exactly as it always had. I watched her hands all day. They were steady, practiced. The hands of someone who had spent 8 years mastering the particular choreography of a surgical suite, who moved through space with the economy of motion that distinguished genuine expertise from its performance. I had trusted those hands with instruments inside open chest cavities. I had trusted them with my patients' lives. I watched them and felt something cold and precise settle in my chest. Patricia Webb had been 2 years ahead of me at Northwestern Medical School. We had lost touch after residency and reconnected 12 years ago at a conference in San Diego, where she had presented a paper on heavy metal toxicity patterns in industrial workers that had made 3 people in the front row visibly uncomfortable. She was now the director of forensic toxicology at a private laboratory on the north side of the city. She was also, in my estimation, the most rigorous scientific mind I had encountered in 3 decades of medicine. I called her from my car on Monday evening. "Martin Cole," she said. "It has been almost 2 years. I need a favor," I said. "Off the record." A brief pause. "Those are my favorite kind. What do you have?" "A coffee sample. I need a full toxicological panel, comprehensive, not standard. I'm looking for anything synthetic, anything that wouldn't appear in a routine blood screen." Another pause. Longer. "Martin, are you telling me what I think you're telling me? I'm telling you I have a sample I need analyzed by someone I trust completely." "Bring it tomorrow," she said. 8 o'clock. Park in the back. I drove home through the Monday dark with the specimen container still locked in my briefcase and my hands steady on the wheel. Not from calm. From the particular stillness that comes when a man has decided on a course of action and committed to it completely. Diane was in my kitchen when I arrived home. She had let herself in with the key I had given her 3 years ago, after Sarah died, because she had asked, and it had seemed like the right thing to give a grieving daughter who lived 20 minutes away. She was standing at the stove, her coat still on, stirring something in the pot Sarah had used for soup every winter of our marriage. "I thought you might not have eaten," she said, without turning around. "I made the butternut squash, Mom's recipe." I set my briefcase by the door and looked at her, the coat still on, the soup already simmering. She had been here long enough to start cooking before I arrived, which meant she had known approximately when I would be home. "That's thoughtful," I said. "Sit down." "Father, you look exhausted." I sat. She ladled the soup into the bowl Sarah had always used for guests, not the everyday bowls, the good ones, white with a thin blue rim, and set it in front of me with a piece of bread on the side, and sat across from me with her hands folded on the table and her mother's eyes watching my face with an attention I was only now learning to read correctly. We talked about ordinary things, a case she was following at her firm, a friend's engagement, whether I had spoken to Michael recently. Then, near the end of the meal, she set her spoon down and looked at me directly. "Father, I've been thinking, with everything on your plate at the clinic, the administrative pressures, the research commitments, it might be worth having Michael take a more active role in the financial oversight, just to reduce your load." I looked at her across the table. Her expression was perfectly calibrated, concerned, reasonable, the face of a daughter who wanted nothing except her father's well-being. "I'll think about it," I said. She smiled. "Good. That's all I'm asking." After she left, I stood at the kitchen sink and washed the 2 bowls and thought about the word oversight, about who had suggested it and why and what exactly they believed needed to be overseen. My briefcase sat by the door. Inside it, a specimen container with a Monday morning coffee sample. Patricia, I thought. 8 o'clock. Park in the back. I dried my hands on the dish towel and turned off the kitchen light. She had her mother's eyes. I used to think that was the most beautiful thing about her. That night, sitting across from her at my own kitchen table, I realized I had never once asked myself what those eyes were actually seeing. Patricia called on Wednesday afternoon. I was between patients when my phone vibrated on the desk. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me and answered on the second ring. "Martin." Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone delivering information they wish were different. The sample came back. Tell me. Modafinil derivative. Synthetic. Not commercially available in this formulation. Combined with a low-concentration cholinergic inhibitor, together they would produce exactly what you've been experiencing: cognitive irregularities, fine motor disruption, fatigue that doesn't respond to sleep. A pause. Martin, this compound did not end up in your coffee by accident. Someone formulated this specifically. I stood in the corridor of my own clinic and looked at the wall in front of me. A framed photograph of the original Cole Cardiac Center, 1994. 4 people standing outside a building that no longer existed. One of them was me, 30 years younger, holding a set of keys. How long would consistent exposure produce measurable neurological effects? I asked. At this concentration, 6 to 8 weeks for early symptoms, 12 to 16 for the presentation you described. Another pause. Martin, whoever did this knows pharmacology. This isn't something you research online. I know, I said. Document everything, every result, every date. Send copies to a secure server I'll specify separately. Already done, she said. Be careful. I ended the call and stood in the hallway for another moment. Then I straightened my coat, opened the patient room door, and went back to work. James Pryor called that evening with his findings on Nexagen. Nexagen Pharmaceutical Partners, LLC, had been registered in Delaware 14 months ago. The registered agent was a small law firm in Naperville, the beneficial owner of record. Buried under 2 layers of shell structure was a man named Richard Holt, CEO of Holt BioCapital, a mid-sized pharmaceutical investment firm based in downtown Chicago. He's legitimate on the surface, James said. But Holt BioCapital has been quietly acquiring cardiac data sets for the past 3 years. Anonymized patient records from smaller practices, research institutions, independent cardiac units, building a proprietary database. Worth what? I asked. If the data is as comprehensive as yours, to the right pharmaceutical developer, with the right drug in development. James paused. Conservatively, Martin, we're talking about a 9-figure licensing value. I sat with that number for a moment. James, I need you to find out who introduced Richard Holt to anyone connected to my family. Any dinner, any meeting, any professional event. 14 months back. I'll need a few days. You have 2, I said. After I hung up, I sat at my desk and thought about the word specifically. Patricia had used it. Whoever formulated this compound had done so specifically, not opportunistically, not carelessly. They had identified what I was, understood what my hands meant to my identity, and engineered a compound designed to take precisely that from me. Gradually, convincingly, in a pattern that would read, to anyone examining it without suspicion, like the natural cognitive decline of a man in his mid-50s under professional stress. Someone who knew me very well had decided what to take and exactly how to take it. Diane came for dinner on Friday. She brought groceries, the specific groceries, the ones Sarah had always kept, the brands Sarah had always chosen. She moved through my kitchen with the ease of someone who had grown up in it, which she had. Opening cabinets without looking, finding things where they had always been. I watched her from the kitchen doorway and tried to see her the way I would see a patient's chart, without assumption, without the overlay of 27 years of being her father. We ate, We talked. She asked about a colleague of mine she had met once at a clinic fundraiser 2 years ago. She asked whether I had scheduled the follow-up blood work my internist had recommended in September. She asked, with exactly the right weight of casual concern, whether I had given any more thought to Michael's involvement in the clinic finances. I had set a small trap before she arrived. Earlier that afternoon, I had called Sandra Reeves, my compliance officer, and asked her to flag any external data requests received by the clinic in the past 18 months. Then, at dinner, I mentioned it to Diane incorrectly. I told her Sandra had found nothing unusual. Diane nodded. "That's reassuring," she said. "I'm sure it was just an administrative confusion." Then, 3 minutes later, without appearing to connect it to anything, though, if there were any irregularities in the data governance records, you'd want James to look at those specifically. Not just Sandra. She doesn't have the legal background. I looked at her across the table. She had corrected the gap in my false information without knowing I had created it. She knew there were data governance irregularities. She knew Sandra Reeves by name and professional limitation. She knew which records James should examine. She knew because she had been watching this operation from somewhere very close to its center. "You're right," I said pleasantly. "I'll mention it to James." She smiled. Her mother's smile. I had always loved that smile. After dinner, I walked her to the door and said goodnight, and watched her car move down the street. Then I went upstairs to the bedroom closet, pushed aside the cedar box of Sarah's journals, and pulled down the folding attic stairs. The gable storage space was low-ceilinged and smelled of old wood and cardboard. I had not been up here in 2 years. I moved slowly through the stacked boxes until I reached the far corner where Sarah had kept her personal things, the items she called not sentimental enough to display and too meaningful to discard. Behind a box of Christmas ornaments, I found it, a small metal box, olive green, a combination lock I recognized Sarah's birthday, a lock I had given her as a joke 20 years ago, because she had complained I never remembered the date. I remembered inside. Beneath a folded scarf and 2 envelopes I did not open was a notebook, small, spiral-bound. The cover water-stained at one corner. Diane's handwriting on the first page. The year she turned 15. There are moments in a man's life when the picture he has been looking at suddenly resolves into something entirely different from what he believed he was seeing. Not because the picture changed, because he finally stopped looking at the parts he recognized and started looking at the parts he had been avoiding. I had been avoiding Diane for 12 years. Not her presence. Her absence, the specific, deliberate absence of the daughter she had been before she turned 16 and replaced herself with someone perfectly correct and entirely unreachable. I had told myself it was grief, her mother's illness, growing up. I had been wrong about what I was looking at. James called on Friday morning, 2 days after I had given him 48 hours. I was in my car outside the clinic, engine running, when the phone rang. I had learned, in the past 2 weeks, to take important calls in spaces where I controlled the acoustics. Nexogen, James said, without preamble. Richard Holt incorporated it 14 months ago specifically to acquire your patient database. The shell structure was designed to obscure the beneficial ownership long enough to complete the data transfer before you could mount a legal challenge. A pause. Martin, the registered agent firm in Naperville, I know one of the partners there. He owes me a conversation. Off the record. The instruction to establish Nexogen came from a private email account. It took me a day to trace the account to its origin. I waited. The account was created at a business center on Michigan Avenue 18 months ago. Paid in cash. But the center keeps security footage for 24 months. Another pause. Martin. It was Diane. The engine ran, outside the windshield. Chicago moved past in its ordinary Friday morning way, entirely indifferent. "You're certain," I said. "So the footage is clear. She was alone. She used a laptop she brought herself and was there for 40 minutes. James's voice was careful in the way it became when he was delivering something he had hoped not to have to deliver. "I'm sorry, Martin." I sat with it for a moment. Not with shock, I had been moving toward this conclusion for days. And a man who has been moving toward something does not arrive at it with surprise. I sat with the particular weight of a thing confirmed. The difference between suspecting and knowing. "Who introduced Holt to Diane?" I asked. They were at Northwestern Law at the same time. Different years, different programs, but they overlapped for one semester in a joint seminar on pharmaceutical intellectual property. James paused. 14 months ago, Holt was looking for a high-value cardiac dataset to anchor his acquisition strategy. Diane knew exactly where one existed. I thought about the dinner Diane had arranged 16 months ago, the one she had described as a casual gathering of professional contacts, the one where Michael had met a man named Richard Holt for the first time, and come home telling me about an interesting investment opportunity in pharmaceutical data infrastructure. Michael had thought it was his idea. He had brought it to me the following week with the enthusiasm of a man presenting something he had discovered himself, and I had listened and said I would think about it. And he had seemed genuinely invested, genuinely excited. He had been a door Diane had opened. Nothing more. "James," I said, "I need you to do 3 things. First, prepare a protective trust covering all Cole Cardiac Center assets and patient records. Structure it so that no guardianship petition can reach the underlying holdings. Second, review every document that carries my signature from the past 18 months. Every one." I paused. "Third, find me a contact at the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Someone you trust personally." A long pause. "Martin, if this goes federal, I know what it means," I said. "Do it anyway." "I'll have the trust documents by Wednesday," James said. "And Martin, the FBI contact. His name is Dan Kowalski. He's been with financial crimes for 16 years. I went to law school with his wife. I'll make a call this afternoon." I thanked him and ended the call, and sat in the parking structure for another few minutes with the engine running and the city moving outside, and the specific cold clarity of a man who has just finished mapping the dimensions of something he is going to have to walk through regardless. Diane had been building this for 14 months, possibly longer. The Northwestern connection to Holt suggested the relationship had existed before Nexogen was incorporated, which meant the conception of this plan preceded its execution by an unknown interval. She had watched me for years. She had learned my schedule, my habits, my trust. She had placed Kara in my professional life. I was almost certain of it now. The timing of Kara's arrival at the clinic 3 years ago corresponding too neatly with what I now understood of Diane's timeline. She had used Michael as a conduit to Holt because Michael was visible, trackable, the obvious suspect, and she had stood in my kitchen, making her mother's soup and asking about my blood work with those gray eyes that saw everything and gave nothing away. She had been so perfectly, so completely correct. Sarah had written about it. A child who has decided to be correct has decided something about the people they are being correct for. Sarah had seen it, had written it down, had perhaps written more on the page that was no longer there. I thought about the small olive green box in the attic, about the spiral notebook inside it, about the handwriting on the first page and the year written beneath it. I had not yet opened it past the cover. I had needed to know this first. I had needed to understand the architecture of what Diane had built before I read what she had written at 15. Because I suspected that once I read it, the way I understood everything that had come after would change permanently. I was ready for that now. I turned off the engine and went inside to see my patients. Michael was never the strong one. I knew that. Sarah knew that. We loved him for it. The way you love the child who needs you most with a particular tenderness that the easier child never quite requires. What I had not understood, until I sat on a bench in Grant Park on a Tuesday morning, watching my son walk toward me with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders carrying something too heavy for them, was that someone else had learned to use that need as a weapon. I had not told him I was coming. I had texted him at 7 a.m, Grant Park, the bench by the Buckingham Fountain. 9 o'clock, come alone, and then turned my phone face down and waited. He replied in 4 minutes. A single word. Okay. That single word told me something. A man with nothing to hide asks why. A man carrying something asks no questions at all. He arrived at 8:57, which meant he had left early, which meant the text had unsettled him enough that waiting felt worse than arriving. He was dressed for the office wool coat, good shoes, but he had not shaved, and there were shadows under his eyes that had not been there at his birthday party 3 weeks ago. He saw me on the bench and stopped walking for just a fraction of a second before continuing forward. I let him sit before I spoke. The fountain was off for winter, the basin empty and gray. Around us, the park held the particular stillness of a weekday morning in November. Dog walkers and joggers moving at the edges of our sight. Nobody close enough to matter. Dad. His voice was careful. Prepared, I thought, for a conversation he had been rehearsing. Michael, I said, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I already know most of the answer. What I need from you is the part I don't know yet. He looked at me. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man who has been dreading a door opening and has just heard the handle turn. Nexogen, I said. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he was looking at the empty fountain basin. How much do you know? He asked. Enough. Tell me your version. He told me. It took 11 minutes and cost him something visible. His voice broke twice, and he pressed his hands flat on his thighs the way he had as a boy when he was trying to hold himself together in front of me. He told me about the debt first. $2 million. Accumulated over 14 months of cryptocurrency investments that had seemed, at each individual decision point, like reasonable risks, and had collectively been catastrophic. He told me about the shame of it, the specific shame of a 30-year-old man who cannot tell his father he has failed. And then he told me about Diane. She had come to him 8 months ago. Not with judgment, he was specific about this, his voice hardening slightly, as if the absence of judgment was itself the thing that should have warned him. She had come with a solution. She knew someone, she said, who was looking for a partner in a data acquisition project. Someone who needed a name, a contact, a point of entry into the right circles. The financial exposure for Michael would be minimal. The return would clear his debt entirely, She said it was Dad's idea, he said. His voice was flat now, the flatness of a man saying something that still does not feel real. She said you had already discussed it with Holt, that you wanted me involved because you were thinking about stepping back from the clinic, and you wanted me to understand the financial side of things. I sat with that for a moment. And you didn't ask me directly, I said. He pressed his lips together. She said you wanted it handled quietly, that you'd bring it up when the time was right. A long pause. I know how that sounds. Dad. It sounds like someone who understood exactly how to use the space between us, I said. He turned to look at me then, and his eyes were red at the rims in the way of a man who has not been sleeping and is running very close to the edge of what he can hold together in public. I didn't know about the coffee, he said. I didn't know about any of that. I swear to God. I thought it was a business arrangement. I studied his face carefully. 30 years of reading patients had taught me something about the texture of honesty under pressure. What I saw in Michael's face was not the smooth surface of practiced deception. It was the raw, ragged look of a man who has just finished understanding the full dimensions of what he had been used for. I know, I said. He exhaled, a long, unsteady breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. Dad. His voice dropped. She's my sister. He stopped. Started again. How long has she been planning this? At least 14 months, I said. Possibly longer. He stared at the empty fountain. A dog ran past us chasing something, its owner jogging 20 yards behind. The ordinary Tuesday morning continued, completely indifferent to what was being dismantled on this bench. What do you need from me? He asked finally. I need you to go to work, I said. I need you to speak to Diane exactly as you always have. I need you to give her no reason to think this conversation happened. He nodded. Slow, but real. And Michael. I waited until he looked at me. I need you to think carefully about the night Diane turned 15. Whatever she has said to you about that night, whatever version she has told you. I paused. I need you to tell me. The color left his face with a completeness that told me, before he said a single word, that he knew exactly which night I meant. There are things a man buries not because he has forgotten them, but because he has decided, in the quiet, efficient way that people decide such things, that carrying them openly costs more than he can sustain while still functioning. I had buried the night of November 14th, 12 years ago, so completely that I had almost convinced myself it was simply a night I did not remember clearly. I remembered every second of it. Michael had told me what Diane told him. She had never spoken about it directly. But in the months she had been drawing him into the Nexogen arrangement. She had mentioned it twice in passing the way you mention something settled, something requiring no elaboration. The first time she said only that she understood what it felt like to need something from their father and find nothing there. The second time she said that some debts were older than money. He had not asked her to explain. He had not wanted to. I drove home from Grant Park and sat at my desk and let the night of November 14th come back completely. Senator Alan Aldrich had been admitted at 4:15 with an acute aortic dissection. The kind of diagnosis that compresses time hours, not days, and every minute carrying specific value. I was the attending cardiac surgeon on call. There was no meaningful question about whether I would operate. By 5 o'clock, I was scrubbed in. At 6:42, my phone vibrated on the tray outside the sterile field. The scrub tech glanced at it. Doctor, Cole, it's your daughter. I did not look up. I'll call back. At 7:18, it vibrated again. Same number, at 7:51. Sarah called. I did not look up. Senator Aldrich's aorta required my complete attention for another 4.5 hours. By the time we closed, it was 11:40, and he was stable, and I was experiencing the hollow clarity that follows a long, successful surgery, the feeling of having spent everything and arrived somewhere worth the cost. I checked my phone in the scrub room. 4 missed calls. A voicemail from Sarah. Left at 8:03. Her voice was controlled. Too controlled, the control of a woman managing something alone because the person she needed was unavailable. Martin. Diane called me. She's at Northwestern Memorial. She's okay. They think she's okay. I'm on my way. Please come when you can. Please come when you can. Not come now. Sarah had known I was in surgery. She had calibrated her message to what was possible rather than what she needed. I drove to Northwestern Memorial at 12:23 in the morning. Diane was in a room on the 4th floor. Sarah sat beside the bed, coat still on, hands folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who had been holding themselves together for hours. She looked up when I appeared, and something in her face shifted relief. And something else she kept carefully in the chair with her. Diane was asleep. She looked younger than 15. Something stripped away in the hospital light that her ordinary surfaces usually concealed. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my daughter. In the morning when she woke, I was there. I told her I loved her. I told her I was sorry I hadn't come sooner. She looked at me with her mother's eyes and said, in a perfectly level voice, that she understood, that she knew I'd been in surgery, that it was fine. It was not fine. I understood that now, in a way, I had not allowed myself to then. I had heard her say it was fine, and I had accepted it, because accepting was easier than excavating what lay beneath. And I had a senator to check on in the morning, and a department meeting in the afternoon, and the 1,000 necessary continuations of a life that did not pause for the things it should have paused for. She had called at 6:42 and 7:18. She had watched my name on the screen and waited. I had not come. I sat in Sarah's chair and held that fact without insulation for the first time in 12 years. Not the smoothed, manageable version. The actual fact. My 15-year-old daughter had needed me at 6:42 in the evening. I had looked at a tray outside a sterile field and said I would call back. The room was very quiet. I thought about Diane at every family dinner since then. Perfectly correct. Perfectly present. The right questions, the right gestures, the right kind of daughter with the thoroughness of someone who had decided correctness was the only armor worth wearing. I thought about Sarah's journal. A child who has decided to be correct has decided something about the people they are being correct for. I thought about the page that had been cut cleanly from the spine, and I thought about the small olive green box in the attic, and the spiral notebook inside it, and the handwriting on the first page, and what a 15-year-old girl might have written in the days after a night when she called her father twice, and he did not answer. I had told myself 2 days ago that I was ready, sitting in Sarah's chair with that November night finally resting where it belonged. I understood that ready was not something I got to decide. I went upstairs to get the notebook anyway. A 15-year-old girl's handwriting is unmistakable, uneven, urgent, like someone writing faster than they can think. Because if they stop, the feeling will swallow them whole. I had read thousands of medical charts in my career. I had read Sarah's journals. I had read my own surgical notes from 30 years ago, and recognized in them the handwriting of a younger, more certain man. Nothing prepared me for reading my daughter's. The notebook was 80 pages. College ruled. The margins filled in places where the lines had not been enough. She had used 2 pens, one black, one blue, switching between them without apparent pattern. The way teenagers write when they are not thinking about the writing, but only about what needs to come out. I sat on the attic floor with my back against a cardboard box and read it from the beginning. The early pages were from September. School had started. A new year. A new teacher she liked for English who assigned actual novels instead of excerpts. She wrote about a friend named Caitlin who had started dating someone Diane considered unworthy of her. She wrote about a sweater she wanted that Sarah had said was too expensive. She wrote about me twice in those early pages, once when I had come to her school's open house, and once when I had taught her to parallel park in the empty lot behind the clinic on a Sunday afternoon. Dad was actually pretty patient today. She had written, after the parking lesson, he only grabbed the dashboard once. I think that counts as a win. I sat with that sentence for a moment. The ease of it. The warmth underneath the humor. The particular shorthand of a daughter who assumes her father's affection so completely that she can joke about it without protecting herself. I turned the page, October. The entries became shorter. The spaces between dates grew longer. She wrote about a boy who had not called when he said he would. She wrote about a history test she had not studied for because she could not concentrate. She wrote, on October 19th, a single line. Sometimes I think Dad doesn't actually see me, like I'm part of the furniture, permanent and unnoticed. I stopped. I read it again. Then I kept reading. November arrived in the notebook with a tightening I could feel in the prose itself. Shorter sentences, more white space. The handwriting smaller and more controlled, as if she were compressing herself to fit inside something that was becoming too small. She wrote about feeling tired in ways that sleep did not fix. She wrote about sitting at dinner and watching me talk about a case and realizing she could not remember the last time I had asked about her day and actually waited for the answer. On November 9th, she wrote, I've decided to talk to him. Actually talk. I'm going to call him this week. On November 12th, I'm going to call him Thursday. November 14th had no entry. November 15th was the last page. The handwriting was different, not the urgent speed of the earlier entries. Something slower, more deliberate. As if each word had been chosen with the care of someone who understands they are writing something they will not be able to take back. I called him twice. He didn't answer. Mom came. The doctors were nice. I have to stay one more night for observation. I've been thinking about why I'm not more upset that he didn't come. And I think it's because I already knew he wouldn't. I think I called him anyway, because I wanted to be wrong. I wanted him to be the kind of father who felt it somehow, who put down the instruments and said something is wrong with my daughter and came. He didn't feel it. He finished his surgery and came at midnight and sat on my bed, and he looked so tired and so sorry, and I told him it was fine because I could see that he needed it to be fine, and I have always been good at giving people what they need. I'm done with that now. Daddy didn't come. Daddy will never come for me. But one day I'll make sure he understands what it feels like to be the one who's not coming back. The last line was underlined. Once. Carefully. The pen had not slipped. I closed the notebook. I sat on the attic floor with my back against the cardboard box and the notebook in my lap, and the single bulb overhead casting its yellow light across the low ceiling, and I did not move for a long time. She had been 15 years old. She had called twice. She had wanted to be wrong about me. She had given me what I needed, the absolution of it's fine, because she had always been good at giving people what they needed. And she had decided, on November 15th, lying in a hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial, that she was done. And then she had spent 12 years being done. Perfectly. Completely. Building something in the space where a daughter had been. Something that looked exactly right from every angle and was entirely, precisely aimed. I thought about the dinner tables, the correct questions, the soup made from Sarah's recipe with Sarah's pot in my kitchen, served in the good bowls, calculated to feel like love. I thought about a 15-year-old girl lying in a hospital bed, deciding she was done. My chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the compound in my bloodstream. I put the notebook back in the olive green box and closed the lid and sat in the attic for a while longer. Because going downstairs felt like a thing that required more than I currently had. Then I went downstairs anyway. There is a particular kind of silence that follows understanding. Not the silence of confusion, not the silence of shock, but the silence of a man who has finally seen the complete picture and is sitting with the full weight of what it means. I had spent 2 weeks building a case. I had spent one night reading a notebook, and somewhere between those two things, the case had changed its shape entirely. I was no longer simply a man who had been wronged. I was also a man who had done the wronging. I made coffee at 6 in the morning. Not from habit, I had not used the clinic coffee since sending Patricia's sample, but from the need to do something with my hands, while my mind worked through what it needed to work through. I stood at the kitchen counter and thought about the question I had been avoiding since I closed the olive green box. Did I have the right to do this? I had built, over the past 2 weeks, a careful and thorough case. Patricia's toxicology results, James's corporate research, the security footage of Diane at the business center on Michigan Avenue, Michael's testimony from the Grant Park bench, the forged signature on the Nexogen document. Enough. James had told me to support federal charges on multiple counts. But I had read the notebook, and the notebook had not changed the facts of what Diane had done. She had poisoned me deliberately and methodically. She had used her brother as an instrument. She had forged my signature and constructed a financial architecture designed to strip me of everything I had built. These things were true, and they remained true regardless of what a 15-year-old girl had written on November 15th, 12 years ago. And yet, I thought about the parking lot behind the clinic on a Sunday afternoon. Dad was actually pretty patient today. He only grabbed the dashboard once. I thought about October 19th. Sometimes I think Dad doesn't actually see me, like I'm part of the furniture. I thought about November 12th. I'm going to call him Thursday. She had been trying to reach me for weeks before that night. Not dramatically, not with the language of crisis, with the ordinary persistent effort of a teenager who wanted her father's attention and kept rescheduling the attempt because the attempt kept feeling impossible. And I had been there, physically present at those dinner tables, in that house, available in every logistical sense, and entirely absent in the one sense that had mattered to her. I poured the coffee and sat down and thought about what Sarah had asked me to promise. Really see them. Not just when they need something. See them when they don't. I had failed that promise with Diane so completely and so consistently that she had stopped believing I was capable of keeping it. She had stopped believing it at 15 years old, in a hospital bed. And she had spent 12 years building a response to that belief with the same precision and patience that I had spent 30 years building my surgical practice. She had learned it somewhere. that precision, that patience. I sat with that thought for a long moment. The question was not whether I had the right to protect myself. I did. Whatever I had failed to give Diane 12 years ago did not entitle her to poison me, forge my signature, or dismantle everything I had built. The law was clear on that. My own conscience was clear on that. The question was what protecting myself was actually for. If I moved forward, if I called Dan Kowalski and executed the trust and set the dinner table and let the federal machinery do what federal machinery does, what was I building toward? A conviction, an ending, justice in the clean legal sense of consequences, assigned and futures altered, or something else? I thought about Diane in my kitchen making Sarah's soup, the correctness of her, the 12 years of perfect performance, and underneath it, a 15-year-old girl who had decided she was done and had been done ever since, carrying it alone, letting it become this. She needed to stop, not for my sake, for hers. The plan I had been building with James and Patricia and Dan Kowalski was not revenge. I understood that now with a clarity that felt like the clarity after a long surgery, everything simplified to what was necessary and what was not. I was not doing this to punish Diane. I was doing this because she had constructed something that would destroy her completely if it was allowed to finish. And the only way to stop it was to dismantle it before it did. She could not stop it herself. She had been inside it too long. And because I had not come at 6:42 on a November evening 12 years ago, I owed her the one thing I had not given her then. I owed her a father who showed up, not at midnight, not when it was convenient, not when the surgery was finished and the senator was stable and the cost of showing up had already been absorbed by everyone else. Now, in time to matter, I picked up my phone and called James. "We're moving forward," I said when he answered. "All of it. The trust. Kowalski. Everything." A pause. "Are you certain I thought about November 15th? About a girl who had wanted to be wrong about me? Set it in motion," I said. "And James, when this is over, I want a referral to the best psychiatric care available in this city. For Diane. Whatever she needs. Whatever it costs." A longer pause. "I'll have names for you," he said quietly. I ended the call and sat for a moment in the early morning kitchen with the coffee going cold in front of me, and thought about what it meant to show up 12 years late and whether late was better than never, and decided that it had to be. Because never was the only alternative. I had spent 30 years making decisions under pressure. The cardiac surgeon's particular discipline, the ability to assess, commit, and execute without the luxury of second-guessing, was not something I had been born with. It was built, procedure by procedure, in rooms where hesitation had a body count. By the time I sat across from Dan Kowalski in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Wacker Drive, I had made my decision completely, and I was not going to unmake it. What remained was execution. Dan Kowalski was 53, lean in the way of men who have spent decades in motion, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned that watching carefully cost nothing and revealed everything. James had described him as the most patient investigator he had ever encountered. Sitting across from him, I understood what that meant. He did not fill silences. He let them work. James had arranged the meeting for a Tuesday morning. The conference room belonged to a private legal firm that owed James a favor neutral ground. No connection to Cole Cardiac Center or anyone associated with it. I arrived first. Dan arrived exactly on time. James arrived 90 seconds later with a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who had reviewed the relevant documents 3 times that morning and was prepared for every direction this conversation might go. I laid it out in sequence. The tremor, Patricia's toxicology results, the forged Nexogen signature, the security footage of Diane at the Michigan Avenue Business Center, Michael's testimony from Grant Park, the missing page from Sarah's journal, the text message on Kara's phone. Dan listened without writing anything down. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at a point slightly above my left shoulder in the way of someone organizing a considerable amount of information. "The compound Patricia identified," he said finally. "She can establish chain of custody on her samples. Already done, time-stamped, sealed, off-site server. And Michael, he'll cooperate formally. He'll do whatever I ask him to do." I said, "He understands what he was used for." Dan nodded slowly. "The Nexogen structure, if James can get me the Delaware registration documents and the security footage, I can have a financial crimes analyst look at the beneficial ownership chain within 48 hours. He paused. "Martin, I want to be direct with you. If this moves forward formally, you lose control of the timeline. Federal investigations proceed at their own pace." "I understand," I said. "Which is why I want to control what happens first." Dan looked at me. "What do you have in mind?" I told him about the dinner. The specific shape of it, the date, the guest list, the sequence of revelations. I told him about Kara, about the recordings I intended to obtain through my own participation in conversations within my own home. I told him about Richard Holt and Emma and the particular leverage that a man whose daughter's life you have saved provides without realizing it. When I finished, Dan sat back in his chair and looked at James. Something passed between them, the compressed communication of men who have worked adjacent to each other long enough to speak in fractions. "The recordings," Dan said. "New York one-party consent rules don't apply here. Illinois requires all-party consent for recorded conversations." "I'm aware," I said. "I won't be recording anything. I'll be present in my own home, participating in conversations, with a very good memory." A thin pause. Then Dan almost smiled. "All right. I'll have 2 agents positioned outside the residence on the evening you designate. Not visible, close." He paused. "And Martin, I'll need everything James has on the Nexogen structure before I can prepare the preservation orders. If Holt tries to move the data after the dinner, I want to be ready to freeze it within the hour." "You'll have it by Friday," James said. We spent another 40 minutes on the trust documents. James walked through the structure with the methodical precision that had made him worth every dollar of 22 years of retainer fees. The Cole Cardiac Center assets, the patient database, the research agreements, the physical property would transfer into an irrevocable protective trust. The beneficial terms were straightforward. The assets existed for the continuation of cardiac care and research. No guardianship petition, no matter how well constructed, could reach them. "Once this is filed," James said, sliding the signature page across the table, "Diane's entire strategy becomes structurally pointless. There is nothing left to control." I signed. My hand was completely steady. Afterward, walking to the elevator, Dan stopped me with a hand briefly on my arm. "One more thing," he said. "Kara Mitchell, you said she's been in your clinic for 3 years. He paused. "She may not know the full scope of what she's been part of. People in her position used by someone more sophisticated sometimes don't. I thought about 8 years of surgical precision, 900 procedures. A woman who had anticipated my instrument changes before I asked for them and known, without being told, exactly when I needed the light adjusted. "I know," I said. "It'll affect how the prosecutor structures her charges." Dan said, "Keep that in mind." I drove back to Lincoln Park through the Tuesday afternoon traffic and thought about what "keep that in mind" actually meant for a woman who had prepared my coffee every morning for 3 years, and what it meant that I was only now, today, thinking about what it had cost her to do what she had done. That evening, I came home to a house that was quiet and unchanged, and entirely transformed. I hung my coat on the hook by the back door, the same hook where Kara's jacket had hung 3 weeks ago, and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The bait was set. The trust was filed. Dan Kowalski had his documents. All that remained was the table. There is a version of coincidence that is not coincidence at all. I had spent enough years in medicine to understand that when two things appear in the same room at the same time, the question worth asking is not whether they are connected, but how. Richard Holt walking into my clinic with his 8-year-old daughter was not coincidence. I knew that the moment I saw his name on my afternoon schedule. What I had not expected was Emma. She came in ahead of her father, the way children do when they are not yet old enough to understand that waiting rooms are for waiting. She was small for 8, dark-haired, wearing a coat with a yellow hood that she had not taken off despite the warmth of the clinic. She sat in the chair across from my desk and looked at the anatomical heart model on the shelf behind me with the focused attention of a child who has spent enough time in medical offices to find them interesting rather than frightening. "Is that a real one?" she asked. "A model," I said. "The real ones are harder to keep on a shelf." She considered this seriously. "Because they need to keep beating exactly right." Richard Holt came through the door 30 seconds behind her. And the man who entered my office was not the confident pharmaceutical executive I had constructed in my mind from James's research. He was 51, well-dressed, but carrying the particular exhaustion of a parent who has been frightened for a long time and has learned to function inside the fear because stopping is not an option. He shook my hand with both of his, the way people do when a handshake needs to communicate more than a handshake usually does. "Dr. Cole," he said. "Thank you for seeing us." I had known who he was for 3 weeks. He had no idea who I was beyond my reputation, which was, I understood, precisely why Diane had chosen him. A man desperate enough for his daughter's life would not look too carefully at the instrument he was using. Emma's file had been forwarded from her previous cardiologist in Boston, where the family had lived until 6 months ago. The diagnosis was clear: a congenital defect, a structural abnormality in the left ventricle that had been managed conservatively for 7 years and had recently progressed beyond what conservative management could address. She needed surgical intervention. The question was when and by whom. I reviewed the scans while Emma told me about a book she was reading. She had a precise and unsentimental way of summarizing plot, the way children do when they have been read to consistently and have absorbed the understanding that stories have structures worth articulating. Her father watched her talk, and his face did the thing that fathers' faces do when they are watching their children and trying not to show how afraid they are. "Emma," I said, when she reached the end of her summary, "would you mind sitting with Kara for a few minutes while I talk to your dad?" She looked at me with the evaluating directness of a child who is accustomed to being removed from rooms so that adults can discuss her. "Is it about my heart?" "It is." "Okay," she said, with a matter-of-factness that cost her father something visible. She slid off the chair and followed Kara out without looking back. Holt watched the door close. Then he looked at me, and the executive composure dropped completely, not dramatically, but the way a coat comes off when you finally come inside. A single, decisive removal. "Tell me," he said. I told him. The defect, the progression, the surgical approach I would recommend, the risks and the projected outcomes at various intervention timelines. I told him the way I told every parent directly, completely, without the softening that sounds like kindness, but functions as obstruction. He listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them the questions of a man who had done his research and was now measuring the answers against what he already knew. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He exhaled. One long breath that carried a considerable amount of the past 7 years in it. "When?" "I'd like to schedule within the next 10 days, I said. "The progression rate argues against waiting." He nodded. His hands were pressed flat on his knees. "Whatever you need," he said. "Whatever the timeline requires. We'll be here." I looked at this man who had, through Diane, become part of something he may or may not have fully understood. And I thought about Dan Kowalski telling me to keep Kara's position in mind. And I thought about the difference between people who build harmful things and people who are handed a role in them without seeing the whole structure. I did not know yet which one Richard Holt was. What I knew was that his daughter needed surgery, and I was the surgeon. And those 2 facts existed independently of everything else. That night, I stood alone in the operating room. I did this sometimes before a complex procedure came in, after the day staff had left. Stood in the quiet of the room where the work would happen. The lights were off except for the emergency strips along the floor. The table was empty. The equipment stood covered along the walls. I held my hands in front of me in the low light. Steady. Both of them. The compound's effects had been diminishing since I stopped drinking the clinic coffee 3 weeks ago, and Patricia had confirmed the clearance trajectory was positive. They were not yet what they had been, but they were close. Close enough, I thought. Close enough for Emma. I stood in the dark operating room and thought about what my hands had built and what they had failed to hold and what they were going to do in 10 days when a small girl with a yellow hooded coat lay on this table and trusted me with the only heart she had, my hands. I thought, still mine. I turned off the emergency lights and went home. 7 hours. That is how long it takes to give a child back her heartbeat. 7 hours in which the world outside ceases to exist, and there is only the chest cavity, the instruments, and the absolute non-negotiable requirement to not fail. I had lived inside that requirement 612 times. I had never entered it carrying what I carried that morning. It did not matter. That was the point. Inside the OR, nothing mattered except the work. Emma was already sedated when I scrubbed in at 7:15. She looked smaller on the table than she had in my office, the yellow coat gone, replaced by a surgical drape. Her dark hair pushed back from her face. The monitors translating her small body's functions into the language of numbers and waveforms that I had spent 30 years learning to read. Ray Simmons met my eyes over the drape and gave me the nod that meant everything on his end was stable and ready. I took my position. Kara was across from me. This was the first time we had stood across from each other in the OR since I had sent the coffee sample to Patricia. She moved with her customary precision, anticipating instrument changes, adjusting the field light in the small, incremental ways that 8 years of working together had made instinctive. She did not look at me differently. She did not behave differently. If she knew that anything had changed between us, she concealed it with a completeness that I recognized, from a different context. As the product of considerable practice, I made the initial incision at 7:22. My hands were steady, not almost steady. Not steady enough steady in the way they had been for 30 years before any of this began. The fine-tuned precision of instruments that had been returned to their correct calibration. I felt it in the first incision, and I did not think about it again because thinking about it was exactly the kind of thing that could make it stop being true. The defect was where the imaging had indicated. The structural abnormality in the left ventricle wall presented clearly once we had visualized the field, and the repair approach I had planned held its logic under the conditions of the actual anatomy, which it did not always do. Emma's heart was small, and the margins were narrow, and the work required the kind of focused deliberation that does not announce itself as courage, because it has no time for announcement. I worked. At the 3-hour mark, Ray reported stable pressures. At 4.5 hours, we completed the primary repair and began the secondary reinforcement. At 6 hours and 12 minutes, Emma's heart resumed its corrected rhythm on the first attempt. A clean, strong beat that registered on the monitors with the uncomplicated authority of a thing working the way it was designed to work. Ray exhaled. Someone on the team said something quiet that I did not catch. I held the field for another moment, verifying, making certain, and then I stepped back. Good, I said. Let's close. Richard Holt was in the family waiting room on the second floor. He stood up when I appeared in the doorway, and the question was already on his face before I had taken 2 steps into the room. She's stable, I said. The repair is complete. Her heart is beating correctly. He sat back down. Not from weakness, from the sudden removal of a weight he had been holding for so long that its absence required a moment of physical adjustment. He pressed both hands over his face and stayed that way for a count of 5. And when he lowered them, his eyes were wet, and his jaw was set with the particular determination of a man who has decided he is not going to come apart in a hospital waiting room. Thank you, he said. His voice was rough. Dr. Cole. Thank you. He stood and extended his hand, and then, with the unself-conscious impulsiveness of someone who has just received the best news of their life, he stepped forward and embraced me briefly. The way people do when a handshake is not sufficient, and they have not yet caught up to the formality the situation technically requires. I let him. When he stepped back, he was composed again, or close enough. Whatever you need, he said. Whatever this clinic needs, research support, equipment, any kind of partnership, just ask. I looked at him for a moment, a man who had come into contact with Diane's plan through a professional relationship. A man who had a daughter who had just come off my table with a repaired heart. A man who had just told me, with the unguarded sincerity of genuine gratitude, that he would give me whatever I asked. There is one thing, I said. He waited. I'm hosting a small dinner next Saturday evening, a family gathering with some professional colleagues. I'd like you to come. I paused. There are some investment matters I've been reviewing relevant to your interests and mine. I think a conversation between us is overdue. He nodded immediately, the way people nod when they have just been given something enormous and want very much to give something back. Of course. Saturday. What time? 7 o'clock, I said. I'll send the address. I shook his hand and left the waiting room and walked down the corridor toward the elevator. Behind me, I could hear Holt already on his phone, his voice carrying the lightness of a man who had just been told his daughter was going to be fine. I pressed the elevator button and took out my phone and sent James a single message. Saturday, 7 o'clock. Holt confirmed. James replied in under a minute. Dan has his people. I'll be there at 6:30. It's time? Martin? The elevator opened. I stepped inside. My hands were still steady. I had performed open-heart surgery 612 times. I had held beating hearts in my hands. I had made decisions in seconds that determined whether someone lived or died. Nothing, not one moment in 30 years, had required more precision than what I was about to do at my own dinner table. The difference between a surgery and what came next was this in surgery. The patient does not fight back. James arrived at 6:30 with his briefcase and the composed stillness of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and knew how to anchor one. He walked through the dining room once, checked the screen mounted above the sideboard, verified the connection to the laptop on the side table, and sat down at the far end without being asked. "Everything is in place," he said. "Dan," I asked. 2 agents? Unmarked car on the north side of the street? He'll come in when you open the front door." I nodded and went to the kitchen and stood there for a moment with my hands on the counter, looking at the window above the sink. Outside, the December street was dark and cold and entirely ordinary. Richard Holt arrived at 6:55. He came in looking the way he had in the waiting room after Emma's surgery, grateful, open, still carrying the lightness of a man whose daughter was going to be fine. He shook my hand and accepted a glass of water and made pleasant conversation with James about Chicago traffic, without appearing to find James's presence unusual. He would, I thought, soon enough. Diane and Michael arrived together at 7 exactly. She came in first, deep green dress, her mother's pearls. That magazine cover composure that I now understood was not composure at all, but architecture. Her eyes moved across the room in the single second it took to cross the threshold. She registered James. She registered Holt. She recalibrated at a speed that would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. She looked at me and smiled. "Father, the house looks beautiful." "Thank you," I said. "Sit down, please. Everyone." Michael sat beside me. He had not shaved. His face was set with the careful blankness of a man executing an instruction he is not certain he can sustain. He had done well 6 days of normal behavior, normal conversations with Diane, normal everything. I had asked a great deal of him, and he had delivered it. We ate the first course. Conversation moved the way it does when everyone at a table knows something is wrong and has agreed by unspoken consensus to perform otherwise. Diane talked about a case. Holt asked about the Millbrook Research Partnership. James responded to every question with calibrated pleasantness and volunteered nothing. I watched Diane watch James and watched her recalibrate again, something tightening almost imperceptibly at the corners of her eyes. She was starting to feel the shape of the room. Between the first and second course, I stood up. "Before we continue," I said, "there's something I'd like to share." The table went still. Diane's hand rested on her wine glass. Holt glanced between her and me with the sudden alertness of a man who has just understood that the nature of the meeting has changed. I picked up the remote from beside my plate and pointed it at the screen above the sideboard. The first document appeared. The Nexagen Pharmaceutical Partners, LLC filing. Delaware registration. Beneficial owner Diane Cole. "That's my family's name," I said. "On a company I never authorized." Diane did not collapse. She was too skilled for that. But something behind her composure shifted the first visible movement in the architecture, the kind of settling that precedes structural failure. "Arthur, I can explain." "Martin," I said pleasantly. "You've always called me Martin, Diane, except when you needed to sound like a daughter." The screen changed. Patricia's toxicology report, the compound analysis, the concentration curve plotted against my symptom timeline. Michael made a sound beside me and pressed both hands flat on the table. The screen changed again. The Nexogen co-sponsorship application with Cole Cardiac Center, listed as institutional backer, the forged signature on page 4, enlarged to fill the frame. Holt pushed back from the table. "What is this, sit down, Richard?" James said, in his courtroom voice. Holt sat. The screen changed one final time. I reached into my jacket and placed the olive green box on the table. I opened it and removed the spiral notebook and set it in front of Diane. The room was completely silent. She looked at it. Her mother's eyes moved across the water-stained cover with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not calculation, not composure, but something raw and involuntary. The expression of someone who has just seen an object they believed was gone forever reappear in the last place they expected it. "I found it in the attic," I said quietly. I read all of it. Something moved across her face. Slow, irreversible. The way ice moves when the temperature has finally crossed the threshold, not dramatically. Not all at once, but with the patient inevitability of a process that cannot be stopped once it has begun. The front door opened. Dan Kowalski came in from the hallway with 2 agents behind him, unhurried. The particular authority of federal law enforcement that does not need to announce itself because its presence is announcement enough. He crossed to the table and placed a document in front of Holt. "Federal Preservation Order," he said. "Covers all communications and assets connected to Nexogen Pharmaceutical Partners." He turned to Diane. "Ms. Cole, I have a warrant." Diane stood. Her hands pressed flat on the white tablecloth, knuckles drained. She looked at me across the table with eyes that were furious and frightened, and something else underneath both of those, something that had no clean name but that I recognized from the notebook. "You planned all of this," she said. Her voice was stripped of every professional layer. "From the beginning." "Not from the beginning," I said quietly. "You gave me no choice." She didn't cry when Dan Kowalski read her rights. She didn't cry when the agents guided her toward the door. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level and her mother's eyes dry and direct. And she looked at me with an expression that contained 12 years of architecture, and underneath it, something so old and so unresolved that looking at it directly felt like looking at an open wound. They gave us 5 minutes. Dan's decision, not mine. I did not ask why. I understood that he had been doing this long enough to know when 5 minutes mattered. The dining room emptied with the efficient quiet of people who understood that what came next was not for them. James guided Holt toward the kitchen. Michael stood from his chair and looked at Diane for a long moment, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the expression of a brother who has just finished understanding something enormous and has not yet decided what to do with it. He pressed his lips together, nodded once at nothing in particular, and followed James without speaking. Dan positioned his agents in the hallway and pulled the dining room door mostly closed. Diane stood at her end of the table. I stood at mine, between us. The remains of a dinner nobody had finished, and the olive green box, and the notebook lying open to no particular page. She spoke first. Daddy. The word came out differently than I expected. Not the controlled, architectural father she had used for 12 years. Something older. The word a much younger girl had used before she decided that father was safer. Did you ever wonder why I stopped calling you Dad after I turned 16? I know why, I said. She looked at me. Something shifted in her face, the faintest disruption in the surface, like wind crossing still water. Then why are you surprised? She asked. I'm not surprised, I said. I'm sorry. The silence that followed those two words was unlike the silences that had preceded them. It had a different weight. The silences before had been tactical, structural, the silences of a confrontation being managed. This one was not managed by anyone. It simply existed. Between a father and a daughter. In a room where everything else had already been said. Diane looked at the notebook on the table. I went back for it, she said. After Mom died, I couldn't find it. A pause. I thought she'd thrown it away. She kept it, I said. She kept everything of yours. Something crossed her face that she did not have time to catch and contain. Just for a moment, a fraction of a second, the 12 years of perfect correctness was entirely absent, and what looked back at me was the face of a 15-year-old girl who had called twice and waited and heard nothing. I read all of it, I said. Every page. She said nothing. The parking lot, I said. The Sunday afternoon. Dad was actually pretty patient today. He only grabbed the dashboard once. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes were very bright. October 19th, I said. Sometimes I think Dad doesn't actually see me, like I'm part of the furniture. Stop, she said. Her voice was not steady. I'm not stopping, I said. Because I spent 12 years not stopping long enough to read what my daughter was writing in a notebook in her bedroom. And I am not going to make that mistake again. She pressed her lips together hard. Her hands gripped the back of the dining chair in front of her, the knuckles whitening with the effort of holding something in. You called at 6:42, I said. And 7:18. I saw your name on the tray, and I said I'd call back. The senator needed a surgeon, I said. There were other surgeons in that hospital. There was only one of me for you. The words landed in the room and stayed there. Diane's grip on the chair back tightened further. Her chin dropped slightly, a single degree of movement, almost invisible. The posture of someone whose structure is beginning to give way at a load-bearing point. You can't just say that now, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You can't just say that and expect it to. I know, I said. I know I can't. I'm not saying it because I expect anything. Diane, I'm saying it because it's 12 years overdue and you deserve to hear it even if it's too late for it to change what happened. She made a sound. Not a word, something that came from somewhere below words. A sound that a person makes when they have been holding something at bay for a very long time, and the thing has finally gotten through. Then she was crying. Not quietly. Not with the controlled steadiness of someone managing their grief for an audience. The hard, ugly, ungovernable kind. The kind that comes when a person has been building and building and building for so long that when the structure finally comes down, it comes down completely. I did not move toward her immediately. I let her have it. The way you let a wound bleed clean before you close it. Because some things need to be felt fully before they can begin to heal. And I had spent enough of Diane's life making decisions about what she needed without asking her. After a moment, I walked to her end of the table and I stood beside my daughter, and I put my hand on her back. between her shoulder blades, the way Sarah used to when one of the children was sick. She did not pull away. She cried for a long time. I stood beside her and did not speak, and did not check my watch, and did not think about anything except that I was here, in this room, present in the way I had not been at 6:42 on a November evening 12 years ago. When it finally quieted, she straightened up slowly, like something rebuilding itself one component at a time. She did not look at me. She looked at the notebook. "What happens now?" she asked. Her voice was wrecked and small. "Now," I said. "We figure out what's worth saving. The morning after the night, everything changes, has a particular quality that no other morning possesses. The house looks identical. The light comes through the same windows at the same angle. The coffee maker sits where it has always sat. And yet the air holds something different, the stillness of a space that has been fundamentally altered and has not yet decided what it is going to become." The dining room was exactly as I had left it. I had not cleared the table after Dan guided Diane out, and James walked Holt to his car, and Michael stood in the hallway long enough that I told him to go home and sleep. I had come back to the dining room, stood in it for a while, turned off the light, and gone upstairs. Some things needed to sit overnight before you moved them. I made coffee at 6:15. My own hands, my own method. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the December street come gradually to life. A neighbor walking a dog, a delivery truck making early rounds, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning, entirely indifferent to what had happened in this house 12 hours ago. The coffee was good. I had forgotten, in the weeks of not drinking the clinic coffee, how much I liked it when it was simply what it was. My phone rang at 7:03. "Michael." I answered on the second ring. His voice was rough in the way of someone who has not slept and has been sitting with something unmanageable since the previous evening. "Dad." A pause. "I've been up all night." "I know," I said. "Is she, do you know where?" "She's been processed. James has a defense attorney meeting with her this morning. She'll be arraigned this afternoon." I paused. "She's not alone." "Michael." He exhaled. "I keep going back to the fact that I let her use me, that I sat across from her for 8 months and believed everything and never once asked you directly, 'Michael.' Never once just picked up the phone. 'Michael.' I waited until the silence told me he was listening. You trusted your sister. That is not a character failure. That is what family is supposed to feel like." A long pause. "She's still my sister," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "Whatever she did." "I know," I said. "She's still mine, too." When he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, still raw, but underneath it, the faint quality of someone who has found a small piece of solid ground. "What do I actually do today? Today you eat breakfast. You call a therapist if you have one. You make no significant decisions." I paused. "And you come for dinner Sunday, 6 o'clock. A brief silence. Then quietly, "Okay, Dad." After I hung up, I went to the dining room and began clearing the table. I found a notepad in the kitchen drawer lined, spiral-bound. The cover faded blue. Sarah had always kept notepads in that drawer. I sat down with my coffee and the notepad and thought about what I wanted to say. Writing to Diane had not been part of any plan. It had come to me somewhere in the dark hours between her crying at the table and the sound of Dan's car pulling away the understanding that what had happened in the dining room was not a conclusion, but a beginning. And beginnings required tending. She would not receive mail immediately. The processing procedures would take time, but the letter would be there when she could receive it, and the one after that. I wrote for 15 minutes. I did not write about the charges or the legal proceedings. I wrote about the parking lot on a Sunday afternoon when she was 15 and learning to parallel park. And the way she had written about it afterward, he only grabbed the dashboard once, and how I had not known until 3 weeks ago that she had written it at all, which was its own kind of answer to its own kind of question. I wrote about the open house in October, before everything went wrong, when she had shown me a paper on the French Revolution, and I had read it standing in her school hallway and told her it was the clearest analytical thinking I had seen in years. I had meant it. I had always meant it when I said things like that. I had simply not said enough of them, and not at the right times, and not when she was asking without asking. At the bottom of the second page, I wrote, "I am going to keep writing to you. Every week, whether you write back or not. You do not have to respond. But I am going to write because it is the only thing I can think of that resembles showing up on time. And I have been late long enough." I folded the letter and addressed the envelope and put on my coat and walked 3 blocks to the post office in the December cold and mailed it before the part of me that was afraid of not being answered could talk me out of it. Walking home, I passed the coffee shop on the corner. I went inside and ordered a cup and sat by the window and watched the street and drank it slowly. I did not think about anything in particular. I found that the absence of thinking felt, for the first time in months, like rest. 6 months is not a long time. It is long enough. However, for certain things to become clear that were not clear before. Long enough for arsenic to leave a bloodstream completely. Long enough for a son to begin rebuilding. Long enough for a daughter to read a letter, and then another. And then on a Tuesday morning in March, in an envelope with a corrections facility return address to write one back. It is long enough. I have learned to understand what you were actually building all along. Patricia called on the first Tuesday of June. I was in the hospital garden when my phone rang a small courtyard off the cardiac wing, where someone had planted rose bushes that nobody seemed to tend, but that bloomed reliably every year regardless. I had started taking my lunch breaks there in April. The habit had begun without my noticing it beginning. "Full clearance," Patricia said, without preamble. "This month's hair samples are completely clean. Martin, your levels are indistinguishable from baseline." A pause, and I could hear in it the particular satisfaction of a scientist who has watched a long process reach its correct conclusion. "You're going to be completely fine." I stood in the garden with the phone against my ear and the June sun on my face, and felt something move through me that was too large and too quiet to name precisely. Not surprised, Patricia had been tracking the clearance trajectory for months, and the direction had been consistent. Something else. The particular relief of a thing confirmed that you had been almost certain of, but had not allowed yourself to be certain of. Because almost certain was the responsible position, and certainty could wait until the data supported it. The data supported it. "Thank you, Patricia," I said, "for all of it." "Don't thank me," she said. "Just keep the follow-up appointments." Emma was in the outpatient recovery suite on the 3rd floor. I stopped by on my way back from the garden, as I had done every Tuesday since her discharge 6 weeks ago. She was sitting cross-legged on the examination table when I came in, reading a book with the focused attention she brought to everything, the yellow hood of her coat visible through the window where it hung on the door hook. She looked up when I entered and said, with the directness that had characterized every conversation we'd had, "My dad says you're the best heart doctor in Chicago." "Your dad is biased," I said. "He says that too," she said, and went back to her book. I reviewed her latest readings with the attending nurse. Everything was where it needed to be, the repaired ventricle functioning correctly, the structural integrity holding, the small heart doing precisely what a heart was designed to do when given the opportunity to do it without obstruction. Richard Holt was cooperating fully with federal investigators. His attorney had negotiated a substantial agreement in exchange for complete disclosure of the Nexogen acquisition strategy and his communications with Diane. Whether that cooperation would satisfy the prosecutor's office entirely was still being determined. What was not being determined was Emma's prognosis, which was excellent, and her father's presence at every appointment, which was absolute. I said goodbye to Emma, and she said goodbye without looking up from her book, and I found that this pleased me considerably. The Eleanor Cole Cardiac Research Foundation had processed its first grant cycle in May. 11 research programs across 4 states. 3 of them focused on pediatric cardiac defects, the area Sarah had cared most about. The one she had spent years reading about in the medical journals she kept on her nightstand, even though she was not a physician and had no clinical application for the information beyond the simple fact that it mattered to her. James had sent a 1-line note with the grant report. She would have been proud. I had read that line 4 times. Michael came for dinner every Sunday. He had been in therapy since January, a fact he had mentioned once and then treated as unremarkable, which I thought was exactly the right way to treat it. He was quieter than he had been before all of this, more careful. The easy charm that had always moved through rooms with him was still there, but less reflexive, chosen. Now, rather than automatic. He asked better questions. He waited longer for the answers. Diane had written 11 letters. The first had arrived in March, 6 weeks after I sent mine. 3 pages, handwritten. The script controlled in the way of someone who has chosen every word carefully and is not yet ready to let the words run ahead of the choosing. She did not apologize in that letter, not directly. Not in the clean, transactional way of someone settling an account. She asked questions instead. About Sarah. About things she half remembered from childhood that she wanted to know if she had remembered correctly. I answered every question. The 11th letter had arrived last week. It was shorter than the others, 1 page, front only. At the bottom she had written, "I've been talking to someone here, a counselor. She asked me what I wanted my life to look like in 5 years, and I didn't have an answer." I think that might be the first honest thing I've admitted in a very long time. I was composing my response when Patricia called. That evening, I drove to the clinic after hours and stood in the operating room in the dark. I had not done this since the night before Emma's surgery. I stood in the same position, in the same low emergency lighting, and held my hands in front of me. Completely steady. Both of them. The hands of a 60-year-old cardiac surgeon who had performed 613 procedures and intended, health permitting, to perform several hundred more. I thought about Sarah in the Vermont garden, laughing at something outside the frame. I thought about a parking lot on a Sunday afternoon, and a girl who had written he only grabbed the dashboard once with the ease of someone who assumed she was loved. I thought about 11 letters and a counselor's question, and a first honest admission. I see them now. Sarah. I thought, standing in the dark with my steady hands in front of me. I see them now. It cost more than I knew I had to learn how, but I see them. I turned off the emergency lights. I went home.